Beverley McLachlin, who served as Canada's 17th Chief Justice in an article titled "The Judiciary's Distinctive Role in Our Constitutional Democracy," stated that it is the rule of law that has traditionally provided the necessary limits on stark majoritarianism. It is the rule of law that ensures that elected representatives do not exceed or abuse their powers, and it is the law that protects minorities and permits the accommodations essential to long-term stability. Over the past 8 months, we have witnessed the rule of law come under intense pressure from a Prime Minister who used his majority position and his agents, namely the Clerk of the Privy Council, a man who was the former Deputy Minister of Northern and Indian Affairs, to harangue, demote, and then expel his Justice Minister from his party because he didn't like her adherence to the rule of law. As Jody Wilson-Raybould points out, we must administer the law evenly across all sectors of society. She paid a significant price for standing up for her principles. She is now an independent member of Parliament who is seeking re-election. We invited Jody Wilson-Raybould to join us for a conversation that matters about her reasons for seeking a second term in Vancouver-Granville, why adherence to the rule of law is fundamentally important in our democracy, and I also wanted to talk in depth with her about an issue of great importance to me and to Canada, and that is improving our relationship with Indigenous people and ensuring they are given the same resources and the same respect that everyone deserves.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program of the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the following and viewers like you. Please become a patron at conversationsthatmatter.tv.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me. You know, I had the pleasure of meeting you once a number of years ago when you had just announced your candidacy, and little did I know what kind of a journey you would be on. And now you've come through the other side of that, and we're going into another federal election. You're no longer a member of that party that you joined. You're not in caucus, you're not in cabinet, and yet you choose to put yourself forward again. How come?
It's a good question. I got involved in federal politics for various reasons. And I feel that my time in politics on the federal level is not finished. I never expected to be in the position that I'm in, but I embrace running as an independent member for Vancouver-Granville. I do not feel that one person, in this case the Prime Minister, can determine for me the length of my career in federal politics. I have had, it's been the greatest honor of my life to serve the people of Vancouver-Granville, and I want to be able to re-earn their support for another 4 years as their Member of Parliament to tackle issues why I ran in the first place, issues around climate change and the environment, issues around social justice, and of course, Indigenous reconciliation.
It wouldn't be unreasonable for somebody who is a member of the riding to say, well, you're an independent now. What kind of influence can you have?
I think, broadly speaking, that we need to look at politics in this country in a different way, in the sense of it's not just about political parties or what the leaders of political parties are wanting to espouse in order to gain power. Although political parties are important to a great degree, but they become something that I don't believe is necessarily advantageous or advancing democracy, in that the leaders of political parties or the members of Parliament seem to be accountable to the leaders or to the Prime Minister, versus what I think is the most appropriate way, having the leader responsible to the members of Parliament and having members of Parliament responsible in turn to their constituents. For me, as an independent in Vancouver-Granville, my only bosses are the constituents of Vancouver-Granville, and I will freely continue to express their views and their contributions to important public policy conversations.
Most of the time, when you're not Jody Wilson-Raybould, you don't have much of a voice. Like, you can go, as an independent, you're not going to be able to garner much attention. But do you think that the events of the last year put you in a unique position so that as an independent, you can actually shine the light on those policies that you believe are fundamentally important to the country as a whole and to your riding specifically?
Well, I mean, it's a unique position. It's not unique. I mean, there's other independents that currently sit in the House of Commons, and there are other. Jane Philpott, for example, is running as an independent.
Right.
I have, through the events of the last 8 months, certainly, but over the course of 4 years, being a minister of the Crown, have been able to gain public attention. I think now so more than ever, but not specifically because of the events of the last 8 months around SNC Lavalin, but around doing my job as the Attorney General, doing what I believe to be right in that job, and having how I feel integrity in doing that job and standing up for what is fundamental to this country, rights and principles and values that underline our freedom and the system of government that we have. For me, that is an incredibly important platform to have. It has brought many thousands of people right across the country to write letters to me to express appreciation. But we're having a conversation about the very nature of our democracy, about politics and accountability and transparency in politicians. I think it's a really important conversation as we move into the election and as we're looking to put an X on our ballot, no matter which riding we live on or live in, and elect people to represent us on the important issues facing our times. So being an independent is, it's going to be a challenge, certainly, to get elected. I'm not a stranger to hard work, but I think more than ever, people need to look at the issues, step back from their hyper-partisanship in terms of their approach to those issues, and have 338 members of Parliament actually digest and plan and act upon issues and have solutions that will stand the test of time.
Well, I got to get you to hang on for a second while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. Conversations That Matter is brought to you by Odlum Brown, a client-focused investment firm that starts client relationships with straightforward conversations focused on you, your aspirations, and your investment priorities. Odlum Brown has been a supporter of Conversations That Matter from the day we started this show. Their only condition was that we provide a non-biased conversation with people from all sides of all sorts of issues. And of course, we couldn't produce this show without the support of Oh Boy Productions. If you're looking to produce a show like this one, I suggest you reach out to Oh Boy. They can help you produce it, and they can help you build your audience. And we also need your support. I ask you to please pledge $1 per show by going to conversationsthatmatter.tv/donate, because those dollars add up and play an important role in helping us produce this show. Now, back to the show. One element of your past that you bring to the equation at any given time is that, as I understand it, you are the highest-ranking Indigenous political figure in the history of Canada, having had the position as the Attorney General, and that brings with it a considerable amount of weight. But also, I think that the way that you handled yourself through this whole affair, which was an application to the law as stated, and I think that there are a whole bunch of people who may or may not have appreciated what you have done. But from my perspective, I have to tell you, I'm happy to see somebody stand up and say, no, it's the law that matters. It really does matter, because if we don't apply the law at every level and through every sector of society, how on earth can we hope that it will be administered fairly to the rest of us? And so from your perspective, because you have a legal background, this has been a big issue. How important is it that we pay attention and adhere to the letter of the law?
Incredibly important, and if anything has been highlighted or lessons that we can learn from the past 8 months since this story has come to the attention of the national media, certainly, but Canadians generally. We live in an amazing country, in a democracy that's foundations are in values and principles and a rules-based order. We need to, certainly as elected officials, be constantly vigilant to uphold the rule of law and to uphold the independence of our institutions. For without that, the very nature of our country, the very thing that we love about our country, its democracy and its freedoms, are compromised. It was an incredible honor for me to be the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada for the 3-some years that I was in that position. And I have to say thank you to the Prime Minister for putting me in that position. I brought my history as an Indigenous person, my culture and my teachings to that role. And what I have been taught in my culture is that we must speak the truth, we must do what is right, and we must ensure that everybody in our community is enabled to play the role that they're meant to play. And a lot of those teachings have led me through being the Regional Chief of British Columbia, Crown Prosecutor, and certainly to the position of Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Well, I hope that those are the same principles that run through the rest of Canadian society as well, because I think that we don't pay quite enough attention to the role of the judiciary in governance in a democracy. That if we don't have faith in that, well, then it's going to undermine democracy as a whole. You can vote for somebody, but if they're not going to adhere to the law, well, then what do we have?
Exactly.
How important is the law to maintaining the kind of society that we want to build?
Well, again, I mean, it's fundamental, and for individuals that are entrusted by the public to make decisions around incredibly important public policy issues and make laws around the environment and climate change, around the economy and taxation and resource development projects, and around the appointment of judges. We need to make sure that all of those decisions are being made based on adherence to the rule of law and based on our fundamental tenets of our democracy, which includes the independence of our institutions, includes the independence of the judiciary and the justice system. For without that, we have people making decisions based on their own will and based on political expediency, and we have to do as much as we can to ensure that that doesn't happen.
Well, I agree, and especially if we hope in this country that there will be an even application of the law to everyone.
Absolutely.
And in particular, and I don't mean to single this out in a derogatory way, but the reality is that the application of law for Indigenous people has been uneven at best and downright disgraceful at worst. And so how can we hope to have the application of law into those communities and for people who are constantly being abused by the system?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and we have been, as a country, confronting the reality of our colonial legacy for some time.
Yes.
Some people more than others, and I think in this day, more people, more Canadians are aware of the colonial realities that have that our country has the history of our country visited upon us,
yes,
and are learning, and that comes through reading and hearing from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, to the report that came out on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls that speak to that legacy. the more people understand it, the more we can actually chart a new pathway to move beyond it. But the application of the law to Indigenous peoples has been incredibly uneven. And I point to the example back in 1982 when we patriated our Constitution.
Yes.
And back then, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which has been an extraordinary thing for our country in terms of rights and freedoms and upholding individual liberties. At the same time, we put Section 35 of the Constitution in place, which is around Aboriginal and treaty rights. The application or how we embrace charter rights is very different from how we embraced Aboriginal and treaty rights. With respect to the freedom of expression, for example, in the Charter, governments have, over the succeeding years since 1982, created laws, created policies to address and embrace and uphold individual rights and freedoms, like the freedom of expression. But the same is not true for Indigenous rights. Indigenous communities right across the country have had to go to court to prove that their rights exist. Governments had said, well, I'm not going to recognize your right, you need to prove it. So it's been that uneven application that's resulted in the situation that we're in.
Right, and if we come back to the role of the court in a democracy, it is the courts that have kept coming back to those governments saying, no, you as a government are wrong. That Indigenous community or this individual, they're right in that expression of their ability and their right to stand up and say, hang on a second, you're trampling on my rights. So as we move forward, like, we go through Delgamuukw, and then most recently Silcotin as being major court cases that start to say we have to change this relationship.
Yeah.
And yet still, I had Senator Sinclair on earlier this year. I asked him, so how then do we start to move to this concept of reconciliation, or at least, a living situation in Canada where we all have access to opportunity and the resources that we need to be fully actualized and so on. How do we get there? And his answer was quite telling. He sort of went, it's complex and it's going to take a long time. How do we get there? Because I thought that we were, putting our foot on the gas when you were appointed and Prime Minister, won the election. It looked like we were going to actually see some movement.
Right. Well, I mean, I would never disagree with the senator. It is incredibly complex.
Yes.
But in its complexity, Indigenous communities particularly, and people across the country, have found solutions to deconstruct their colonial legacy, to move for First Nations beyond the Indian Act, which is a incredibly debilitating colonial piece of legislation that still controls the vast majority of Indigenous peoples from the time they're born to the time that they pass away.
I think that's something that most non-Indigenous Canadians don't understand.
Absolutely, and there's books that are out there to help explain things, to understand the realities that Indigenous communities living on reserve people experience. But the colonial legacy is long, but this country, prior to the arrival of Europeans, Indigenous peoples have title to the land. That was affirmed in the Chilcotin case here in British Columbia. They have the inherent right to self-govern. So how do we get back to that place, recognizing we're all here to stay, as the Supreme Court of Canada says? We need to come to a place, and this is what I've strongly advocated for as regional chief, and as I sat around the cabinet table as a minister of the Crown, where we recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples and in that recognition, create the space for Indigenous communities to be self-determining, including self-governing, and having a land base over which to build communities, having shared territory or shared governance arrangements with other governments around how to manage or cooperatively manage land, having a revenue base in which to build your governments. But the government of Canada or our country does not have a simple mechanism for First Nations communities across the country to move out from under the Indian Act, to become self-governing, short of going to court for years and years or participating in interminable negotiations with governments to get a treaty. We need a simple mechanism when an Indigenous community is ready, willing, and able to remove themselves from the Indian Act, that they're enabled to do so and to rebuild their core institutions of government and then have intergovernmental relationships around various jurisdictions. That's the opportunity that we have.
Right, and when realized, the benefit is universal. It's not just to that community, it's to surrounding communities and to the country as a whole. I've kind of hijacked this conversation around that because it's such an important topic to me, but I feel that you have done an extraordinary job in being able to highlight some of these issues. And I don't mean to take away from your campaign, which, because you said, I want to come here and talk about why I'm running for re-election.
That's okay.
But I think that this is a fundamental part of it. And I know that climate and environment are equally important to you in representing the people of your riding.
Yeah.
You know, I've got only a couple more minutes left. Is there another message in particular that you would like to put out right at the moment that people can look to say, okay, you know, I want to vote for you?
On Indigenous issues?
No, on anything, because as I say, I've kind of hijacked this and taken it in this direction. So, I leave it to you to say, well, hang on a second, I got another point that I want to make.
Well,
because, I'm not a single issue candidate,
Yeah.
which you're not.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity, and I mean, to close out that conversation, I agree with you fundamentally. When Indigenous peoples finally see themselves in our Constitution and are able to rebuild their nations, it will not only improve Indigenous communities, but it will improve the country as a whole. To the voters of Vancouver-Granville, but to Canadians generally, every election is important. This election is incredibly important. We have some really serious issues that are confronting us as Canadians. Indigenous reconciliation, certainly. Climate change is the biggest issue that we have to confront, and we have to do something in the next 10 years to make a difference, to meet our targets. But this is an opportunity, and this is why I embrace where I sit right now in terms of being an independent member of Parliament, hoping to go in past October the 21st, is we have an opportunity as Canadians to send individuals to Ottawa that go there based on principles and values and the priorities that they have, and to remember the reason why people wanted to go to Ottawa, to engage in discussions as much as we can with our partisan hats off, and to have those discussions about important public policy issues. What I'm hearing from the people on the doors and on the streets of Vancouver-Granville, from accountability to healthcare, and to be able to represent directly those constituents. We're not in Ottawa to be responsive or responsible to a leader. We're in Ottawa to be able to ensure the voices of the people for whom we are wanting to represent are represented. Those are the people that matter. It's Canadians that matter, and I hope that Canadians come out in this election and vote for the individual that they think will best represent them in Ottawa.
Well, I've talked to a number of people from a variety of different political persuasions who have wanted to get behind you and support you. Exactly what the reasons are, I can't list them all, but you have attracted a lot of attention, and I think it's around the concept of values. I want to see somebody who says, these are the values that are important to me, and I'm going to stand up for them, and I'm willing to pay a price for it. And you most definitely have done that. Thank you very much for coming in and sharing this.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.